Hello, in this video I want to analyze, was fall of the Soviet Union one of those events that was just bound to occur, or was it an accident of history? Okay, let me first give you an example of an event that most historians would agree was bound to occur in order for you to understand the terminology. So the fall of communism is widely regarded as one of those events that was bound to occur. It was bound to occur because it was caused by multiple factors that had nothing to do with each other. The fact that there was a Sino-Soviet split was one of those events, and because of it, not only was the reputation of both China and the Soviet Union weakened on the international stage, but the Soviets were actually forced to keep a very strong military presence on their border with China, which is something that the United States didn't have to do. They had a privilege of having non-psychotic neighbors on their borders, and the Soviet Union was, after all, attacked by Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution. In fact, they were attacked in 1969. The event is known as the War of the Usura River. Now, Mao Zedong even had solid arguments when he claimed that parts of Russia or the Soviet Union were actually unfairly given to the Russian Empire back in the 18th century, but still, to attack such a powerful country was a crazy move. Then, one of the other occurrences that caused the fall of communism is the fact that the Asian tigers managed to rise their economy, and I'm talking about Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea. And this great prosperity that occurred in those countries actually showed that even Asian capitalism can be more productive than the planned economy of the Soviet Union, and that was a signal for the general secretaries of the Soviet Union that something needs to be done, that planned economies and communism is probably not a good way to develop your country if you want to stay competitive with the Americans. And finally, the planned economies themselves, in eyes of most historians and economists that I read, well, planned economies, while they can be very efficient at allocating certain resources and developing certain branches of the economy, like space exploration, they are just less productive than the free markets. And the Soviet Union also suffered from many other problems, such as the oil prices going down. It was also not good for the planned economy that relied on oil, and the fact that their agriculture was almost permanently in a very bad state is also widely considered to be one of the reasons for the fall of communism, as is the war in Afghanistan. But when we look at the fall of the USSR, it was caused primarily, I would argue, by three bizarre events that occurred in the 20th century. Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Now, let us take a moment and appreciate how bizarre it was that a man like Gorbachev became General Secretary. Because Gorbachev was essentially a liberal. He still believed in some aspects of Marxism. He didn't want to fully privatize the economy like Yeltsin, but he believed in freedom of speech and in democracy. The first fair elections ever held in Soviet history happened under Gorbachev. Not to mention that he actually removed the leading role of the Soviet Party from the constitution, which essentially made Soviet Union, at least Archie claims so, a very respectable historian, a liberal country. Essentially, the Soviet Union became something very close to a social democracy under Gorbachev. It did. Now, that was a crazy event. Then the second crazy event that kind of sealed the fate of the Soviet Union was the fact that there was a military coup launched against Gorbachev. And third and most important thing is that the military coup was a failure, and without these three events occurring, I would argue that Soviet Union would probably still be in place. And throughout this video, I will explain why I think so. Okay, but first, I want to tell you something about the late stage of the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union was embarrassed on international stage because two of their general secretaries, Andropov and Chernenko, died in a very short period of time. And Andropov, by the way, you can see him on this picture, was one of Putin's favorite general secretaries, because both Putin and Andropov actually hate alcoholism, and they both wanted to crack down on alcoholism. And Andropov actually inspired Gorbachev in his attempts to crack down on the alcoholism problem in the Soviet Union. But Andropov was also obsessed with sanctioning people for taking parts of their working hours to go get a haircut. And he wasted a lot of resources, police resources of the Soviet Union, on catching people that were trying to get a haircut during their jobs. And then he died, and he was succeeded by Chernenko, that died after only 13 months of his rule. And people already began to talk jokes on the Soviet streets that now there is a new custom that when they appoint you to be the general secretary, they also agree to put your ashes in the Kremlin walls. And because of it, the Central Committee decided they needed to go with a younger person. And when I say young, I'm talking about 54 years of age, but still, compared to Chernenko and Andropov, Gorbachev seemed to be very young. And many hoped that a younger person will finally not die after a few months, and that a younger person is precisely what the Soviet system needs in this desperate time of stagnation. But still, in the early 1980s, we are not talking about a crisis that was bound to destroy the Soviet Union. Many countries went through economic crisis without collapsing, and that is why I believe that without the liberalization that was done under Gorbachev, the Soviet Union would probably still exist. But what some right-wingers in Russia also kind of deny is that we can't simply blame Gorbachev or Yeltsin for the fall of the Soviet Union. We have to at least equally blame the military coup that was done by the right-wing hardliners in the Soviet military, that in their desperate attempt to save their homeland of socialism from falling apart, they actually caused it to fall apart. Now, let me explain how liberalization actually led to the fall of the Soviet Union and why it was a necessary condition. Well, Gorbachev actually never used the term liberalization because he knew that it was a term used by the West, and he was on multiple occasions attacked by the hardliners that claimed that he is a Western propagandist, that he wants to force Russia and the Soviet people to adapt a Western style of life. And Viktor Chebrikov, the leader of KGB, actually attacked Gorbachev for using the term bureaucratic authoritarianism. And he told him and the rest of the Central Committee, he said that is a Western term, but Gorbachev, since he read a lot of Marxist theory, could reply, no, comrades, Bukharin used the term. And his knowledge of Marxism actually helped him to present all the reforms that he did as something Marxist. So instead of free speech, he spoke of glasnost. And instead of economic reform, he spoke of uskorenie, which means acceleration. And while Gorbachev was definitely right when he decided to liberalize and allow free speech, let us not forget, after all, that in 1989 the Soviet Union not only allowed people to read the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, but they actively printed and distributed the book. And Solzhenitsyn himself said, let us not forget that it was Gorbachev and not Yeltsin that introduced freedom of speech to the Russian people. And Gorbachev also had one ace up his sleeve that allowed him to kind of force even the hardliners to accept more freedom of speech, and that was the Chernobyl disaster. But I'm going to talk about it later to a higher extent. But when it comes to the economy, unfortunately, Gorbachev managed to screw the Soviet economy and made it even worse for the ordinary guy than it was before, in the early phase of stagnation that occurred in the early 1980s. So what Gorbachev did is he passed a law on cooperatives in 1988, and that law gave more freedom to the factory managers. But in a vacuum, that was a good law that decentralized the Soviet economy and made it closer to the Marxist ideal. But in a situation where we already had inflation occurring, that led to the factory managers raising prices and using inflation in order to earn more money for themselves. And that just made the inflation even worse. As you can see on this picture, there are Soviet people desperately waiting in lines to get goods like soap, coffee, razor blades, and alcoholism was also a huge problem in the Soviet Union, which is why Gorbachev decided to crack down on alcoholism and restrict it, made it very difficult for people to buy alcohol by banning it in most stores. But unfortunately, that led to the Soviet state losing quite a lot in revenue, because alcohol was one of the products that that sold best on the internal market, and that also unfortunately made the economy even worse. But what is interesting, traffic accidents in the Soviet Union were reduced quite significantly, so it also had some good things occurring, this reform. But Gorbachev in the end decided to just return back and allow people to drink as much vodka as they want. But at that point it was too late. His restrictions already made the inflation worse, and he was unable to control inflation. That was one of his biggest mistakes that he did as a general secretary. But he needs to be congratulated and honored for allowing all these freedoms to occur. He allowed the freedom of assembly. In 1988, he allowed people to form groups that were not controlled by the Soviet party, and people even found a memorial, which was a group that had a simple purpose of honoring all the victims of Stalin. And what is interesting is that while liberals and leftists got freedom of speech, is that Russian nationalists also got the freedom of speech, and very soon they began to argue that actually the Russian people need to return to their tradition, and tradition meant no liberalism. Alexander Dugin was one of the people that started to claim to present that argument to the Russian and the Soviet people. But here we can see how Chernobyl looked after the disaster, and as I already said, the fact that the Soviet state tried to keep the entire fiasco a secret only embarrassed them even more in the long run, and Gorbachev therefore had an argument that freedom of speech is good. He had a very strong practical argument that freedom of speech is good, and that is one of the reasons he managed to get the Soviet society to accept this new bizarre thing, and that was a freedom of speech. And what is kind of bizarre is that Gorbachev's Soviet Union could be described as the opposite of China today. While they still had a planned economy, although to an extent decentralized planned economy, they had both democracy and freedom of speech. And I'm going to explain what do I mean when I say democracy. Well, Gorbachev actually allowed people to vote for the members of the Communist Party. The problem was that in Stalinism, even the inter-party elections were actually fake. That was the problem, and Gorbachev was the first Soviet politician that actually did allow the Russian people to freely vote for their representatives. And okay, it wasn't still a Western democracy, so under Gorbachev the Soviet people got the right to elect their representatives in the body that was called Congress of the People's Deputies of the USSR, and then that body would elect the Supreme Soviet, which was an equivalent of the American Senate. And he also gave quite a lot of power to the Supreme Soviet. So all of this led Ronald Reagan to actually visit Moscow and to admit that there were big changes made in the Soviet Union. And one of the most epic lines that Ronald Reagan ever spoke actually occurred in during his visit. He was asked by a Soviet reporter, "Do you still believe that the Soviet Union is an evil empire?" as he said previously in 1983. But in the late 1980s, Ronald Reagan replied, "No, I was talking about another time, another era." And what he meant to say is that the Soviet Union is no longer an evil empire. And I really like that historical moment. It showed that peace between the Soviet Union and the United States actually is possible. And yeah, here we can see the Supreme Soviet that for the first time actually had power to actually even veto the decisions of the General Secretary. But what also started to happen in the Soviet Union is that as Gorbachev was allowing more freedom to the Soviet people, the satellites that were controlled by the Soviet Union are also gaining more freedom. And here we can see the protests in Poland, but Gorbachev's unwillingness to use force actually led to the Warsaw Pact collapsing, which is why Alexander Dugin quite explicitly said that Gorbachev had no historical right to end the Warsaw Pact, and then he added, and Yeltsin, well, he needed to be shot before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And for Dugin, one of the greatest mistakes and one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century is Gorbachev not using force in order to stop separatism. But he still sees Yeltsin as the guilty guy, as the main let's say as the guy that did the most damage to his vision, to his dream of a strong Soviet empire. And Putin shares many of his views. And Yeltsin actually, not Yeltsin, Gorbachev actually decided to go full democracy mode, and he actually decided to legitimize his rule and the rule of the Soviet state through democracy. And as the economic situation was becoming worse, he still decided to hold a referendum. And he actually did ask the Soviet people, "Do you want the USSR to exist as the union of equal and sovereign republics?" And in that scenario, that new union would be called Union of Soviet Sovereign Republics. It would still remain USSR, but instead of socialist, there would be sovereign. And what is interesting is that other than in Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, and the Baltic states, which refused to hold a referendum, so we have no data about them, in all the other republics, more than 70% of the people said, yes, we want the Soviet Union to remain a country. Even in Ukraine, the people said they want to remain in the Soviet Union, which is why I believe that Soviet Union could have remained to exist as a unified country, a decentralized country, but it would be probably, I wouldn't say something like the European Union, because they would still have a common military, the collective military, but it would be probably something like Chechnya and Putin's Russia. It would still be a union states, although less centralized, but it could have continued to exist because the people at the time were still afraid of suddenly breaking from their motherland, because they were supplied cheap oil by the Soviet Union, and also once they were given freedom of speech and democracy, they had no real reason to hate the country that gave them freedom of speech and democracy, in a way guaranteed those very same rights. But something very important happened. The military was too afraid of this referendum that Gorbachev decided to organize, and they decided, we have to do a coup. This new guy Gorbachev, he's too dangerous. He's going to destroy our empire. And Gorbachev's prime minister Pavlov, his vice president Yanev, and General Plekhanov decide to do a coup, and Gorbachev is arrested. But the crucial event of the 20th century is that the Soviet military did a rookie mistake. They never arrested Yeltsin, and Yeltsin in 1991 was already, he became a president of Russia, and he already proclaimed the Russian Communist Party. And Yeltsin, although he is remembered as a drunken and incompetent fool by many, he did something great, and he saved the Russian people from this new bizarre dictatorial military regime that was implemented. The self-appointed new state committee proclaimed that now all the power belongs to them, and what it was essentially military taking all the power from the civilian rulers of the state, and that is something that even Lenin and Stalin were against, and that is why the Soviet people simply couldn't support such a coup. And Yeltsin did something great. He stood on the top of a tank in front of the Moscow White House, and he held an epic speech for all the Russian people. He told them, we must resist the coup. You must not let the criminals and the military hardliners take away all your freedoms from you. And the people actually surrounded Yeltsin, and they refused to let the military arrest him. And the military, quite ironically, was unwilling to just shoot at all the masses that gathered around Yeltsin, although they themselves hated Gorbachev for not using enough force. Now they were unwilling to just shoot at their own people, and because of it, Yeltsin remained in power, and he simply, in order to preserve his power, decided to proclaim independence from the Soviet Union. After all, he was afraid that after this coup failed, it actually only lasted 3 days, but he was afraid that the Soviet military might launch another coup, and in order to be safe, he proclaimed the Russian independence. And at that time, it was the only time in Russian history that the Russian people actually supported independence from the Soviet Union. They actually also saw this proclamation of independence as a guarantee that they wouldn't be ruled by the military, by this new military dictatorship that almost managed to return the Soviet Union back to the Stalinist days, or even to something worse, to some bizarre form of military junta fascism that would probably look something like the Putin regime today, but much worse. And yeah, so simply out of self-preservation, Yeltsin actually proclaimed independence, and he also disliked Gorbachev and blamed him for the bad state of the economy, and Yeltsin wanted to go full capitalist mode, unlike Gorbachev, so he had additional reasons for proclaiming independence. But quite ironically, these reasons had nothing to do with actually this idea that Russia is somehow being exploited in the Soviet Union. Some other republics felt like Russia is exploiting them, but definitely not Russia. And as I already said, the Soviet people simply couldn't tolerate a military dictatorship, and that is why they supported Yeltsin in his proclamation of independence. But once the threat of the military coup was gone, what happened became one of the greatest tragedies from the perspective of the Russian people. At the time they were celebrating, but a few years later they began to see what happened as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, because families suddenly found themselves at different sides of the border, and many normal working people were traumatized by this event, but so were the psychotic megalomaniacs like Putin, that dreamed of restoring the Russian Empire. And I would argue that this great event that happened and changed the history of humanity was by no means bound to occur. It was a result of three bizarre coincidences. The first one is that Gorbachev gained power. The second is that there was a coup launched against him. And the last one is that the coup was a failure. Okay, that's all for this video, and don't forget to share, like, and subscribe if you like this video. See you in the